Eamonn Flanagan, thank you for joining me again. It's been a long time virtually, not so long in person, which is good. But yeah, thanks for coming on.
My pleasure. Always good to talk. Always enjoy our chats. And you gave me a free T-shirt once, so
Oh,
you own me basically.
people
Yeah,
love a free T-shirt.
yeah.
Actually,
It goes very far.
yeah, people love a free T-shirt. Um, it's been a while, so I think it'd be best to kick off and do a bit of a quick rundown of your background, what you do now.
Yeah. So right now I am, and for the last, gosh, I think 7, 8 years now, I've been the lead of the strength and conditioning department at the Sport Ireland Institute, where we look after the basically our Olympic and Paralympic athletes across all of Ireland's high performance sports, or most of Ireland's high performance sports in an Olympic and Paralympic context. So yeah, I've been at our Institute of Sport for just about 8 years, and before that I had about 8 to 10 years in high level amateur and then professional rugby at Edinburgh Rugby with the Irish Rugby Football Union, um, part time. When I was starting off as an early career practitioner, part time with teams like Munster and club teams in Ireland. So that's kind of the strength and conditioning, practitioner journey that I've had. And I suppose I had a background in research at the beginning of that journey also, where I did my PhD at the University of Limerick. And it was mostly probably in the area of stretch shortening cycle function, while we looked at anterior cruciate ligament reconstruction. Specifically, most of my interest in the project was around plyometrics, stretch shortening cycle function, and really how we think about that and how we train it and how we assess it.
Why was that an interest? What was the kind of kick-off of that for you?
Yeah, I guess I was when I was doing my undergraduate in the University of Limerick. A friend of mine and a colleague at times, Dr. Tom Cummins, who worked for Munster Rugby at the time, he was actually doing his PhD as an embedded team member with Munster Rugby. This is back in, I guess, 2003, 2004, and he was doing his PhD in the area of complex training. Pairing up heavy resistance training with plyometric exercise. And I just thought that was the coolest thing in the world. Like, imagine being embedded with like one of the best rugby teams in Europe at that time, the best rugby team in Europe, and doing applied research like that. I just thought it was amazing. I wanted to do a project very similar to that, but we didn't get funding for it because it was probably focused on that niche of elite athletes with very, very limited, I would say, application to the wider public. So in the end, my supervisor and I, we took the direction into more of a generally applicable topic. Again, ACL injury and things like that. But I think for me, the interest was always in the applied training principles of plyometrics and high powered training modalities.
So there's a full disclosure before we go any further, I think, is now a good time. We've got a course coming that we recorded just before Christmas, which I'm super excited about. And I feel like I've been stalking you send me about for quite a long time. So it was great to get you over in Leeds and get the course filmed. So we're going to dive into a few of the areas that you spoke about on the course. I hate to put a time frame on this, but it'll probably be start of the second quarter of the year, so in the spring. But that gives us plenty of time to today gives us plenty of time to dive into some of them topics. But the area of the course was plyometrics, but not just plyometrics and jump training, which is probably where I went down first when I approached you. But it kind of moved down the true plyometrics versus the rest of the kind of jump training that often gets bundled together. So first off, what are true plyometrics to you?
Yeah, so I guess maybe it's worth describing why we ended up in that direction with the course, and ultimately it's a short course compared to, let's say, the great stuff that Alex Natera has put out with you, which is a big meaty 5, 6, 7 hour feast of information. This is much shorter. And I think ultimately when people talk about plyometrics, depending on who you're speaking to, they might be speaking to different things. They might be talking about what we might call jump training. They might be talking about what Verkhoshansky or Smith-Bleicher means when they say plyometrics. It's like a lot of topics in S&C. It can be sometimes a little bit of a mess in terms of definitions and clarity around what we actually mean when we say a word like plyometrics. So again, with it being a short course, we probably spent most of our time on the course, but not all of it, in that area of, what we might call kind of high impact, true plyometrics, which in my mind probably means, I think sometimes people might delineate that based on contact times or coupling times, and I've spoken about this a lot, fast stretch shortening cycles or slow stretch shortening cycles, contact times of less than 200 milliseconds or more than 200 milliseconds. And it's probably a little bit more granular than that. So I guess when you mentioned that term, true plyometrics, that's where in the course I'd probably lean on some of Verkhoshansky's definitions mostly. And I guess in terms of some of his frameworks, on one side you probably have what they might describe as like non-impact modalities. That might be your slow stretch shortening cycle, jump training, box jumps, vertical jumps, tend to be maybe maximal but slow stretch shortening cycle activities. And on the other side, that's where you probably have your impact plyometrics, which again, I think they tend to be maximal or near maximal efforts. They have a very definitive like impact or collision with the ground. They have very short contact times. And they tend to follow, I guess, what you could call like a plyometric cycle of arrival or preparation. That might be falling from a box for drop jumps. It might be arriving toward the ground when you're bounding. So you have your arrival, you have your impact, where you actually impact the ground, and the ground almost blocks you and stops you before you go into your amortization phase, which is effectively what brings out the stretch reflex. And then you follow that into your rebound phase, where you get that release of elastic energy, you get that little bit of concentric push off the ground, and then you go into your next, you might call it your rebound phase, but it's basically your next flight phase before you land or before you do the next activity, if it's bounding or repeated jumping. So I guess those true plyometrics tend to be high intensity, they tend to be short ground contact times, and they tend to have, again, those very definitive phases of, arrival, impact, amortization, and rebound. And so they tend to be the high impact activities we think about when we see people bounding, hopping for distance, doing drop jumps, doing repeat hurdle jumps. And again, I think in our space, in our industry, sometimes all those plyometrics can all get bundled, all those jumping activities can all get bundled into the same category. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that. It just depends on how you want to define something. But there's a lot in that, and I think in the course we've probably just deliberately focused on those types of exercises that probably fall more within the true plyometric category. Because again, for me, the exercises and the activities that fall within that category, they're the ones that are really very unique. They're the ones where you're probably getting unique training adaptations that are very difficult to get in the weight room. They're very difficult to get with medicine balls or other training tools. And so they are the very high-powered, high-speed, I would say reactive strength dependent activities that provide some really unique training adaptation, some really unique, preferential strengthening of fast twitch muscle fibers that's very difficult to get anywhere else.
And if we'd have not gone down that route, we'd have been there all day. Oh, well, we were there all weekend, exactly. All week.
So let's focus on the stuff that actually, I say it's high powered and has some unique training adaptations. It's also difficult. Like, it's difficult stuff to coach, it's difficult stuff to organize in safe, effective progressions and hierarchies. Whereas I think most people are pretty comfortable programming box jumps, counter movement jumps, relatively low impact activities that you tend to kind of program in similar rep ranges and with similar methods that you do your kind of strength or power work in the weight room anyway.
Do you think people get or try to get their athletes the true plyometrics quicker than they maybe should do because it's sexier? It's
I think it kind of depends, really. Good question. I think for me it fundamentally comes down to what the athlete is prepared to and where they've been and what they're ready for and what adaptations or what positive influence you're hoping to have. We're all kind of familiar with those maybe cliched heuristics of, you must squat 2 times body weight before you do X, Y, and Z. And I don't think those rules necessarily apply, because in some cases you could work with athletes who have maybe extensive track and field, athletics backgrounds, and they would be very well prepared and very well skilled in activities like skipping, hopping, bounding, and they're safe and effective tools to use with those athletes. You'll get other athletes with very high levels of strength because of what they've chosen to do or what they've been exposed to in their training history, but they might be very poorly prepared for high threshold, high impact plyometrics because they've had little exposure to that type of training modality. So I think the athlete context is really important in terms of what they've been exposed to and what, from a foundational training history and a foundational movement competency, what are they actually prepared and ready for? I think that's one thing. I think the other piece is that, there can be an element sometimes of you maybe don't need to use some of these methods until you've already utilized the low-hanging fruit of building basic levels of strength, building basic tissue tolerance, building basic fitness characteristics. And so I think there's an element there where sometimes you can try and get to the sexy stuff first when there's actually opportunity to get pretty easy training returns from simple strength training or simple, gym-based power training with athletes who are earlier in their development. But like anything, sometimes when you need to use a tool, you want to already know how to use that tool. So I think for an athlete, plyometrics may not be the main thing at this point in time, but it's always worth building up the exposure to these types of activities, so that when you want to use that tool at a high level, the athlete has been exposed to it, they know the techniques, and they're able to implement it when they need it. And again, I think a lot of the time, let's say with, Verkhoshansky, some of these methods, people will think about plyometrics as solely being the shock methods, the drop jumps from high heights or depth jumps from high heights. But again, when you look at some of the Verkhoshansky frameworks, that there's a special place for submaximal, plyometrics, what we might call extensive type work. There's a special place for the true plyometrics that we've spoken about, but even that is delineated into more general work. Again, it might be your drop jumps, again quite non-specific but really focused on moving the dial on those physical qualities. And then also there's a special place for your functional plyometrics, which might be I might think of them as maybe transfer to training exercises. For a sprinter it might be bounding, you know what I mean. For a gymnast, it might be drop jumping or landings from very high heights of some kind. So again, even within that category of plyometrics, there are different reasons that you might use it and different approaches that you might take.
Mm-hmm. Little follow-up question to that. So the 2 times body weight kind of introduction to that, or the cutoff, is often kind of ridiculed as like, where did someone pluck that from? But is there anything like that you would think is more appropriate as a bit of a general tick box to say that I think that athlete is ready, or is that just too simplistic and we shouldn't even be thinking in that region?
I think to put like a hard and fast number on it or threshold on it is probably a bit too easy or a bit too simplistic, because ultimately, even when we talk about a back squat, like, we all know all back squats are not created equal in terms of their depth or their tempo or, whatever. So I think that probably is a little bit oversimplistic. But again, maybe the principle to which that hints at is just this idea that, if you have a young developing athlete, and we all know, that actually if you're a young developing athlete and you get them in the weight room for the first couple of years, it's pretty easy to make relatively significant gains in strength without even putting the athlete under too much, physical stress from session to session. So I think maybe what those types of principles hint at a little bit is the idea that, like, save those, high-powered, high-return exercises for when you need them, for when the gains, for when the athletic development is beginning to get into that plateau stage and it's a little bit harder to move the dial. You know, if you've exposed your young athletes who are still developing physically, who haven't laid down a maturity in terms of their strength levels, their muscle size, their exercise technique, if you're exposing them to high hurdle jumps or drop jumps, you probably get some training return from that. Like you're going to get some changes in physical quality in return to that, in return from that, no doubt. But you know, in 4 or 5 years' time, when they're hitting that stage of kind of diminishing returns from their training, those tools perhaps could have had a more potent influence, and you've almost used them up when you wanted to rather than when you needed to.
Perfect. You mentioned a couple of categories there. Mm-hmm. How do you categorize your plyometrics? Your true plyometrics.
Yeah. Okay. I guess. Well, I guess you can categorize them based on exercise type for starters. And again, like I said, in a lot of S&C world, there's ambiguity and there's a lack of clarity around exercise types. That's the first way you can categorize them. And the way I would, if I was trying to keep things really simple, I would think about probably 4 categories: jumps, hops, bounds, and skips. I probably should have put them in a different order, but let's say, jumps, skips, bounds, and hops. And again, jumps, we're taking off on 2 feet and we're landing or we're rebounding on 2 feet. With skips, we're taking off on 1 foot and we have that kind of short, long rhythmic transfer from 1 foot to another. And when we're doing bounding, we're taking off on 1 leg, we're landing on the other leg. When we're doing hopping, again, it's unilateral, but it's the same leg, boom, boom, boom. We're staying on the right leg for all the repetitions. So that's one way to categorize. And there probably is at a very basic level, there's probably an intensification across those levels, from jumps to skips to bounds to hops at a very basic level. Obviously, it depends what way you do them and everything. So that's probably the first way I would categorize them. Again, if we think about how we implement, that's categorizing the exercises. If we think about how we implement the training, then we might categorize it, which is pretty standard now, via extensive or intensive. And again, extensive work tends to be, it might be the same exercises. You might do repeat hurdle jumps, you might do pogo jumps on the spot, you might do single leg hopping, but in your extensive phase, they may not be true plyometrics because they're not those near maximal or near maximal efforts, but they may be the same exercise categories. But again, in the extensive type work, we tend to obviously dial down the intensity, increase the volume. We work maybe more on kind of rhythm. We get a lot of repetition, so it's a good environment to coach within. And on the intensive side, that's where we're dialing up the intensity. That's where we're at near maximal or maximal level. That is where we are a little bit more focused on output rather than, we're still focused on technique, but we might be a little bit more focused on output rather than the technical issues. So again, extensive versus intensive is another way that we could categorize how we're applying the exercises. And then I guess the last way you might categorize is based on intensity, and actually what do we feel is the intensity of the exercises, and we might put them into categories or groups based on those our best guess or our perception of the relative intensity of these exercises.
I remember speaking to Mark Jarvis in the very early days of the podcast, because I'm sure he did his PhD in this area. I can't remember. Yeah, that seems to ring a bell. And we were talking about understanding the intensity of plyometrics. I'll be honest, it's 8 years ago. I can't remember what he said, but I'd like to get your.
Yeah, I do.
You do. What's your idea of how you bucket the intensity of these type of exercises?
Well, let's go back to Mark first of all, because I think one of the big takeaways I had from that podcast, and I don't know if this is PhD.
I love the fact that you do, by the way.
I know. One of my big takeaways from that was not, and I don't know if this was PhD work or if this was just cool stuff he was messing around with, in his training environment. But and this is definitely, that's something that fits into my philosophy now, is, we have this idea that, if you and I both do a bench press at 90 kilos and we both have the same relative strength, that probably has a similar effect on us. But he made the really interesting observation that, like, let's say you and I both come off a 40 centimeter box for a drop jump. We might make the assumption, if we were the same body weight and we're doing it on the same surface, we might make the same assumption that that's the same relative intensity for both of us. But Mark's, again, my big takeaway from Mark's podcast was actually, a lot of the time it's the really talented athletes, the fast twitch animals, the real reactive strength, elastic athletes. They can just do
like me and you.
Like you, yeah, not like me, like you. And they can just do something different in these types of activities. They can put 10 times body weight into the ground in 180 milliseconds, and I can't. And so again, we think, oh, this athlete is well prepared. They're explosive, elastic. They've got really good RSI scores, so they're more able for plyometrics than somebody else. And there may be an element of truth in that, but also you need to have that consideration that they can do something that ordinary folk can't do. And this exercise represents a really an outlier in terms of the amount of intensity that these special athletes can produce in these types of exercises. So I guess then you got to think about, okay, well, when we think about, you still need a framework to work from. And I think what I take from Mark is that, the athlete that's in front of you needs to be one of your moderating factors when you're thinking about what exercise will I do, how much volume of that exercise will I do, how often will I do it, etc. But you still need a framework to start from where, you can think about, okay, well, what is actually a higher intensity exercise than another? So I guess, there's no gold standard study. There's no perfect study that takes 100 plyometric exercises, measures them all, and puts them in a perfect hierarchy. That doesn't exist. There's a few that have done it with some exercises, but not others, and they've used different ways of measuring, blah, 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 but there's no perfect standard. So you've got to kind of just use, common sense, and you've got to use, I think, just general heuristics to lead you in the direction of organizing your plyometric categories. And so when we talk about plyometric intensity, I think in S&C land, a lot of the time we think about actually, well, how much stress does the exercise place on the muscle, the connective tissue, the joints involved in the action. That's one way of thinking about it. From a purely probably like Newtonian physics point of view, you can think about it as, what is the momentum of the body right before it hits the ground? Do you know what I mean? So again, how far have they fallen? What's the mass of the object? That's the other way of thinking about it. And so I think in terms of those heuristics, two things to start with. Intent. Obviously, if I go 80% on a drop jump or I go 100% on the drop jump, I'm going to produce a lot more force in a shorter time period when my intent is maximal. And surface matters. If I'm on a hard, stiff surface, I may get a better performance, or I may get more force in a shorter time period, but obviously that can come at a cost of the amount of stress we place on the connective tissue, the joints, etc. So if we assume that intent and the surface is standardized, it's not, but if we assume that it was, well, then again, the way I would think about those exercise kind of hierarchies would be, again, short contact times versus long contact times, or fast stretch shortening cycle versus slow. Your faster activities will tend to have more force or similar levels of force in much shorter time periods, more intense. Single leg versus double leg activities will tend to be a higher level of intensity or intensification, because you're taking that same level of impact force through a single limb, not shared across both limbs. There's a little bit of research from people like Dr. Bill Eamonn that talks about what the leg does before ground impact. So if you have like rapid extension of the leg before ground impact, it tends to spike up ground contact forces. So think about things like tuck jumps, pike jumps, repeat hurdle jumps, where you have this kind of tucking, but then this rapid extension of the leg into the ground. That tends to peak ground contact forces compared to, let's say, pogo jumping, where the legs remain extended before ground contact. The height of arrival, you could call it, or the drop height in drop jumps, That's going to dictate intensity. Obviously, if I step and fall from 60 centimeters or I step and fall from 30 centimeters, the 60 centimeter drop jump will have a much higher impact momentum. It'll drive up intensity. And then I would also consider maybe more horizontally orientated plyometrics as potentially having a little bit more of probably an increase in an increase in joint reaction force at the knee. That's probably worth considering as well, where I'd probably, the greater the horizontal component, the more I would consider that an intensification of the same exercise if it was done with a more vertical bias. So you got these kind of 6 or 7 heuristics, and for me then that probably just broadly, there's going to be overlap and it's going to be messy and it's not going to be perfect, but broadly that probably helps me like bucket exercises maybe into 3 or 4 tiers, and at the lowest tier you probably have like submaximal exercises, and you have maybe jumps up to targets. That could be up steps or up boxes, where because you're jumping up, you're landing from a very small height, gravity isn't acting on you for very long, and you have a lower impact momentum. My second tier, as we work up the tiering of intensification, that might be more in-place jumps. It might be submaximal skips and bounds, some of those single leg activities, or it might be in-place jumps like pogo jumps on the spot, for example. As we move up the hierarchy, when we get to maybe the third tier, that might be some of those in-place jumps, but that has those kind of forceful leg excursions we talked about, tuck variations or hurdle variations. It might be, some repeat actions like skipping. Maybe we're getting to bounding in this tier. And then at our highest tier, that's probably where we're looking at, very high intensity hopping. Might be where we're looking at our drop jump activities. And again, a lot of our single leg variant of drop jumps or single leg hops and bounds would be possibly in that tier as well. So again, we have these kind of common sense heuristics where I think if, tick, 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 if all these things are in play, it's probably pretty high intensity. And if tick, 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 none of these things are in play, it's probably low intensity. So you kind of build up your little checklist in your coaching mind, and that can help you. Maybe for me, I would bucket into maybe 4 different categories roughly.
How does foot placement and I suppose the cueing from the coach of foot placement, how does that affect intensity? How does that affect focus when it comes to these true plyometrics?
I think as a starting point, I'd say that's probably an area I don't have a high degree of certainty about, and I'm willing to, it's probably something I'm reflecting on, and probably we did address in the course, but I'd probably continue to reflect on. If you look at some of the research, there's maybe, from what I can see, 3 or 4 half decent studies out there, and they look at things like forefoot placement versus flat foot placement, or the athlete's preferred foot placement in plyometric activities like drop jumps or hurdle jumps. So again, usually what these types of studies do is they set up a jumping activity, they measure, joint reaction forces or ground reaction forces, and they cue the athlete to perform them as you please, preferred. They cue the athlete to perform them with a forefoot landing, or they cue the athlete to perform them with more of a leading with the heel or a flat foot landing. If you look again, maybe through like maybe a simplistic S&C coach lens, if you look at a lot of those studies, a lot of them will show that the forefoot landing, so that's kind of landing on the ball of the foot with the heel probably elevated and off the ground, that tends to have shorter contact times, higher rates of force development, might be a little bit more appropriate for your fast force application. So straight away as an S&C coach, that can be really attractive. That can be like, oh, that's what I want to do. I like RFD. I like short contact times. This sounds good to me. I'll go in that direction. Couple of problems with these studies. First of all, they tend to be cross-sectional studies. So again, you're cueing an athlete in a particular way, and you're observing the immediate outcome from that, as opposed to coaching an athlete a particular way for 6 weeks, 12 weeks, 6 months, 6 years, and observing what the outcome of that is. A lot of these studies as well, again, they look at those kind of ground reaction forces, contact times, the stuff that's probably instantly easy, relatively easy to measure. They may not look at what the shin is doing during that short contact time. They may not look at like the relative distribution of force through the foot. And so I think while that approach is, let's say, attractive at a basic level, ultimately with plyometrics, I probably still consider plyometrics as strength training. You know what I mean? Like, it's just, we're training, your fast twitch fibers, and we're training your strength in very, very short time periods. But I still consider it as relatively non-specific, strength training compared to whatever the action of the sport is. So again, when we go to a little bit more of a flatter foot landing, or where we're leading with the heel a little bit more, I think you tend to get less translation of the shin over the foot, which probably unloads like the Achilles tendon a little bit. You get more, I would say, you're distributing the same level of force or similar levels of force across the whole foot rather than all of it on the forefoot. And you may end up with slightly longer contact times, but I mean, I'm looking at some numbers here. We're probably talking about the difference between like 180 milliseconds and 200 milliseconds. Either way, it's still way faster than anything you do in the gym. And either way, it's still slower than what you do when you're sprinting. Do you know what I mean? So like, to me, it's a special strength exercise. So it's still in that category. And I think the value you're getting there is you're not getting that, what can be sometimes quite extreme translation of the shin over the foot. You're getting that little bit more of an even force distribution across the foot. And it probably also allows athletes to remain in slightly more kind of stable, strong, kind of stacked postures and positions when they are doing things like bounding or repeat hurdle jumps, for example. What I would say is my gut feeling in terms of experience is that, again, with the exception of maybe athletes who have that extensive experience in athletics, and they've had a very kind of long-term exposure to jumps and bounds and hopping and bounding. Other athletes, I think, tend to default when you ask them to get off the ground quickly. You ask them to like bounce, you ask them to do a test and hit good RSI scores. I think a lot of them do default to that very kind of forefoot landing. And again, a bit like those research studies, if you cue them flat, it doesn't feel that good to begin with. Their scores get worse, their contact times get a little bit longer, it feels a bit heavy, it feels a little bit high impact. But I think if you coach through that and coach out the other side of that, you end up with, I would say like movement competency that's more robust, that's more adaptable, and is probably more sustainable long term.
So would you go there if you were starting with an athlete tomorrow? Would you go there straight away? In terms of the flat heel, leading with the heel?
Yeah, I think one of the first things I do is I'd almost, not always, but almost always start with that more, because again, we might talk a little bit about training progressions. So without getting into that right away, generally we'd probably start with more, you might call it extensive or preparatory, sub-maximal plyometric work anyway. I think that's your opportunity to see what their default movement patterns are, how do they execute the task you've given them within the constraints that you've given them. And I think sometimes there you'll see people who, probably actually can't stop their heel hitting the ground, aren't in control of that. You'll see people who want to stay on the forefoot excessively. And I think in those kind of lower level, lower intensity, extensive plyometrics, that's where it's much easier to coach that. This is the type of thing that's been popularized by Altus, the rudiment series type approach. It's, the kind of jumps in place circuits that, Boo Schexnader, that you've had on the podcast a couple of times, would preach about the importance of. And they're really, really good coaching opportunities because it's not maximal intensity. You've got loads of repetition. It's very hard to coach high-end plyometrics sometimes because you're doing such small volumes. By the time you're ready to coach the right thing, they're done. So again, those extensive phases, you've got lots of repetition, you've got relatively high volumes, you've loads of opportunity, for me anyway, where I don't have an amazing coaching eye for this, you've got loads of opportunity to actually watch, see if that's a one-off or see if it's see if it is consistent across multiple reps and sets. You've loads of opportunity to cue, and it's very low risk to change something technically because you're tending to do it at low intensities, or oftentimes we do it on softer surfaces like grass or tumbling mats or whatever. So I think that's a good time to do it quite early in the process.
Perfect. Well, we've nailed the intensity. We've nailed the categorizations. Let's move on to volume. Again, NSCA book. There's things in there that people may or may not agree with in terms of volume prescription. What's your thoughts on this?
So hopefully this is something that we do relatively well in the course, and we give people, hopefully there's a range, but hopefully we give people, a range of plyometric training volume that they may think about operating within, depending on which stage of training that they're in. So we'll get to that kind of progression model maybe next. So in terms of volume, I guess again, you look at some of the studies, or you look at some of even the position stands. Like there's an NSCA position stand, for example, and they might talk about 150 foot contacts for athletes of different experience levels. There might be some research papers that look at high volume versus low volume plyometrics, for example. But again, if you look at some of those methodologies, a lot of the time they're not really differentiating between drop jumps or counter movement jumps or cone hops, like activities that honestly they're as different as a back squat and a power clean. Do you know what I mean? Like when, they're probably more different if anything. So I think a lot of those plyometric training volumes that are out there, I wouldn't say there's anything wrong with them. Again, they just tend not to be particularly granular. And again, the typical way they suggest is that, beginners do this much and experienced athletes do more, a greater volume, for example. Again, I'm not against that principle. It obviously makes sense if you're strong, you're robust, you've got good training history, you probably have the capacity to do more. But again, like we spoke about, with Mark Jarvis's, some of his work and some of his insights, actually maybe the more elastic and reactive you are, the more phenomenally high outputs you can put into a single set, and actually maybe you need to be doing less, like the same, again, if a donkey like me does the same exercise as an elastic, thoroughbred, they're doing a hell of a lot more for the same reps and sets. So again, I think when we think about volume, the first thing I would think about is like, what phase are we in? And in terms of progressing a plyometric training model, I kind of think about 4 phases: a kind of a foundation phase, a development phase, and then we really get into intensification, which could be more general or more functional. The general stuff might be your drop jumps, your repeat hurdle jumps, again, really trying to move the dial on the underlying physiological kind of qualities of the athlete. Or you're maybe functional, or you're transfer focused high intensity plyometrics, which might be a little bit more trying to match the biomechanical characteristics of the plyometrics to the sport or the sporting action that you're trying to improve. So again, I have maybe 4 phases of plyometric training or plyometric progression, and I think your volume guidelines within each of those phases would be quite different. Obviously, when we're talking about foundational or development work, or again, what people might more broadly might describe as extensive work, it's a maximal, you have high variation, you can do a lot more work. At the upper end, in terms of intensity, where we're really intensifying the work, we do much smaller pockets, smaller volumes of work. So for me, I guess the influencing factors of plyometric volume. So again, what are the key things I'm thinking about which would dictate whether I'm doing a lot or a little in terms of volume? Would be, I guess, fundamentally, what phase of training am I in? And then outside of that, it would be, what is the intensity of the plyometrics I'm using? So like I mentioned before, I might broadly bundle my plyometrics into four tiers of increasing intensity. So if I'm using a high intensity plyometric exercise, then I'm going to be dialing the volume down. And we mentioned already surface is important. If I'm doing extensive work on a soft, forgiving surface like grass or sand or a tumbling mat, then I know I can get away with doing more volume, more repetition, because I want to build tissue tolerance, I want to have more coaching opportunity, I want to have more technical development. I would say the variety or the range of different exercises you're using is another kind of influencing factor on volume. So if I'm doing high intensity plyometrics, but I'm choosing to just do one exercise, I'm going to do drop jumps, let's say, for example, I'm choosing to do drop jumps, and that's the only exercise I'm doing, and I'm doing 3 sets of 6 or 3 sets of 8 with very long recoveries on high box heights. I'm only doing a single exercise. I'm loading the joints and the connective tissue in a very similar way repeatedly at very high intensities. I'm going to dial the volume down. If I'm exposing the athlete to 3 or 4 different exercises, I have variety of how the joints and the tissues are being loaded from exercise to exercise, then I can probably get away with doing a little bit more volume across the total session. I don't mean more volume on every single exercise. And then, like we said already, the athlete level is going to be important. Again, what has the athlete been previously exposed to? Have they built up, have we established their kind of plyometric tolerance and their kind of training volumes that are appropriate for them? And also, what type of athlete are they? Are they that elastic, greyhound who just bounces and springs along the ground? Are they a little bit more of a workhorse? Again, for that elastic athlete, although they might appear better suited for plyometrics, for true elastic plyometrics, I may actually be inclined to dial the volume down for them because their outputs are at such a high level. So again, the intensity of the exercise, the surface that we're performing it on, the variety of exercises used, the level of the athlete themselves, I think about each of them as kind of like the knobs on a stereo. So again, I'm turning them up or down depending on maybe what I'm thinking about or what I'm assessing in those different, across those different kind of factors.
You'll remember the quote. I just know you're going to remember the quote. Boo's quote about variety and injury prevention.
Yeah, so variety is the mother of injury prevention, and I think it's a simple thing. Like if you're playing, dealing with rugby players and you shuttle run them every day and they're turning in the exact same way on the spot over and over again, you end up with groin issues, you end up with adductor issues. If you expose them to a variety of stimulus, especially at submaximal level, obviously, I think you're making them, more robust and more adaptable, and you're stressing them in different planes of motion with different tempos and different intensities, but you're also not overloading the same pattern repeatedly. Now, there are times where you want to drive meaningful physical adaptation, and I think when you want to do that, sometimes it makes sense to pick one key exercise, to do it for the right amount of volume at very, very high intensities, and unashamedly focus on that, with the blinkers on, and get it really, really well done. But that to me is at the end of a long process, not the beginning.
So the last thing, you've flirted with it a few times, the progression frameworks that we spoke about in the course, just to get a bit of an overview of those would be a really nice place to finish off, I think.
Yeah, cool. Again, I've put some of this stuff out in articles I've written before on social media and stuff, and just my personal approach. But again, I don't know if it's plagiarized from other people, if it's reference to other people, if it's just, maybe it's just common sense stuff. But ultimately, most people think about moving from, increasing intensity and decreasing volume as we move towards a specific goal. A lot of people already think about extensive plyometrics and intensive plyometrics as their two categories or their two different approaches. I probably just think about it in maybe, I would say like four steps in a progression model. And the first 2 steps probably are more in that extensive domain. I would call them a foundational phase and a development phase. The foundational phase for me is like, some athletes may never do this. It might be too low level for them, or you might do it with them when they're 16 and you don't need to go back there very much in the future. But for me, the foundational level work is really, very, very low level, very low intensity, jumping, hopping, landing, skipping, very low intensity, very much submaximal. and effectively you're just trying to help the athlete to learn the techniques, understand what stiffness, pre-activation, what these simple kind of concepts feel like, and you're building their very basic level of tolerance to plyometrics. Again, this kind of stuff that goes well with this type of training, you could have people doing marching drills, ankling drills, building their, foot, ankle, calf strength at the same time, intrinsic kind of foot strength. It's really basic stuff. I think in that development phase, that's probably more similar to what most people would think about when they think about extensive plyometrics. And again, here you're really building the volume tolerance. Again, it tends to not be maximal, tends to be nowhere near maximal intensity work, but we're establishing their plyometric training volume. We're building volume tolerance, or I think you can use this phase to begin to build intensity tolerance too. So here is where maybe some of your tier 2 plyometrics can come in. Your pogo jumps, with short contact times, you can begin to intensify them a little bit, but you're probably not doing high intensity true plyometrics at this point. So again, foundation, development, and then for me, you come into the intensification realm. And I would tend to think about what I would call realization next. Again, maybe going back to the Verkhoshansky approach and some of his frameworks, he might call some of this work your more general true plyometrics. So again, it's stuff where we're trying to make physical adaptation, physical changes. We're not necessarily trying to overly match the dynamic correspondence or the biomechanical demands of the task. So here we might be doing our repeat high hurdle jumps. Drop jumps might come into this phase if the athlete is ready for it. So that would be for me the realization phase. And then not so much a progression, more as an option running alongside that, you would have what I would call maybe your transfer phase. And this is where you may actually be slightly diminishing the intensity of what you're doing compared to that realization phase. But you're probably trying to be a little bit more mindful of what is the physical or what is maybe the technical change or influence or impact I'm trying to have in the sport, and what plyometrics might be best suited to make that difference. So these might be more, again, functional plyometrics, you could call them. For a sprinter working on stride length, it might be bounding, for example. So that to me, it's not quite a 1, 2, 3 approach. There'll always be overlap between these different phases. When I'm working on general high intensity realization focused plyometrics, I might still keep in some low intensity extensive work in a different session in the week, or we're touching on some of that work as we intensify through a session. So again, it's never a 1, 2, 3, 4 step method. It's just trying to work with a common sense progression, trying to think about what the athlete needs, and again, as we intensify, we're thinking about, are we intensifying to really drive acute physical adaptation with realization methods, or are we trying to intensify more through the dynamic correspondence or the biomechanical characteristics of the plyometrics that we're choosing?
I think this will be my last question, but it was one that I think we chatted about when you joined Boo and Joel on that round table, but it was jumping for jumpers. And I'm just wanting to get your kind of off the cuff thoughts on that for those that are working with those that are jumping regularly in their sport, netball, basketball. How would you view that? Would you, like Boo mentioned, keep that low level, like foundational developmental progressions in there all the time, knowing that they're doing the final phase day in, day out anyway? From an injury prevention point of view, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, I'll try not to speak outside, again, where I feel like my expertise
is.
I don't work or haven't worked with high level jumpers, whether high jumpers or long jumpers or basketball you mentioned there. But I think the principles are the same. I think you've always got to think about, like, what is the athlete being exposed to in their sport practice? What are they being exposed to in the elements of their training that you have little control over? And then what can you expose them to in your domain, in the gym, in their physical preparation, that might add some value, but not just double up on some of the some of the stressors that they're already being exposed to. So again, my gut feeling there with what you've described is, again, if you're dealing with athletes who have had long experiences with repetitive, moderate to high intensity plyometric actions throughout their training week or throughout their long-term athletic development, then I wouldn't be as inclined to feel like I needed to build up their tolerance to this type of work, assuming that they're relatively tolerant to it and they're not breaking down all the time. And then, so again, instead what I'd be thinking about doing there is, okay, well, what are the high threshold methods that I can use that might actually be able to help them move the dial on some of the characteristics that matter most in their sport. You know what I mean? So again, maybe it's a sport like basketball where you're from observing training and talking to coaches and talking to the athletes, maybe you have that observation that actually they're doing a huge volume of moderate intensity bounces and pings and jumps, but actually because the sport places a constraint on them, they have very few exposures to the very high intensity work that might actually help them move the dial on some of their physical qualities. So in a case like that, you might keep in a small dosage, every week or every 10 days of general high threshold true plyometrics to try and, keep some of that elasticity and keep those kind of physical qualities moving in the right direction. But I'd probably be quite conservative and reluctant to add in volume if I felt there was a lot of moderate to low level volume in the day-to-day training activities.
Perfect. Right, we've gone past the hour, so I've failed in my promise to get it done by 9. But anyone that wants to know more about you, your work, what you've got going on, where's the best place?
I guess Twitter is probably the only place, unless you call to my house. So at Eamonn Flanagan, I'm on Twitter. I'm not really on any other platforms. So yeah, hopefully, like in terms of plyometrics, I put musings and ramblings and stuff like that up there all the time. And a lot of what we've talked about, whether it's that 4-step plyometric model, whether it's, differences between extensive and intensive stuff, whether it's, the influencing factors around plyometric intensity or plyometric training volume. A lot of this stuff is sometimes can be difficult to describe here, but it's very easy to visualize in a picture or a table or a chart. And hopefully there's lots of resource there that when people see it, they'll say, oh, okay, I kind of get what he was talking about now.
Yeah. Which is the whole reason why the course has been put together. And it was great to get you and see you doing your thing in front of the camera and with an athlete as well. So like I say, hopefully second quarter of the year, we'll get it out. See how it lands. I'm sure people love it.
Sounds good to me.
But Eamonn, thank you very much for joining me on a late on a Thursday evening, and I'll let you get back to it.
My pleasure. Thanks very much, Rob.
Cheers, buddy. Thanks, mate.
Yeah.